That's a tired Sam. Hello, tired Sam. Dude, I published 3 new videos on Egghead.
Oh, wow. You got the SWR stuff.
Yep.
Split up.
Yep. They're
Very
out.
cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's pretty
Can
neat.
Can I watch them, or do I have to have an account?
They're free.
They're free? Cool.
All the Egghead videos I've made so far are free.
Very cool.
But yeah, it's fun. They have a very specific style of doing like 3-minute videos. So it ends up being like 5 lines of code. So I made one video. I thought it was going to be one video, and it was like 10 minutes long. And then now it's 3 videos. But I think it's for the better, you know?
Yeah. We're always trying to get our videos shorter. And,
yeah.
It sounds like they found the secret.
Yes. The secret is like 4 lines of code diff.
4 lines.
Which is kind of a nice little rule, like 3 to 5 lines is going to give you 3 minutes right there, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you would think if you asked me how long does it take to explain 3 lines of code, I'd be like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's pretty cool though. It's my next experiment I want to mess around with is React Query, because that's another library in the same vein as SWR. That lets you, it's a data fetching library that's based on React hooks. And has a client-side cache that you can manipulate. So both of those libraries let you build like an optimistic UI. So yeah, I'm interested to see the differences.
Cool.
The other cool thing about Egghead is that you can make a collection. And so I started off by thinking this was going to be a one-off video, and then I turned it into 3. And the guy who's like my mentor there or whatever was like, you can turn these into a collection, so you can just share, you know, creating an optimistic UI with SWR, and it'll just share all the videos, like a playlist, basically.
Very cool.
And
okay, so the fact that you had to make it 3 videos isn't that big of a deal.
Right. And then also if I have other ideas, I can like add on to it. That's kind of what collections are for, is like, you know, videos that flow together or that you just want to start, but you don't know where it's going yet. It's kind of how we make series on Ember Map, and you can just kind of keep appending to them. So it's cool because I ended the video, basically the 3 videos go through like turning a pessimistic UI into an optimistic. So first you update the cache with the data on the client, then you save the thing and then update the cache with the data from the server, and then you indicate that like the background save is happening with like a little indicator. So those are like the 3 videos. And then like, but there's more parts. Like the natural follow-up is like, oh, if there's an error, like roll back, you know? And I didn't have that in the original video because I thought it was one video and I wanted to keep it as small as possible. But now I can just keep making small videos and add to it, you know?
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So I was thinking next I'm going to do the rollback thing with error. And then what I want to do is like experiment with like extracting a hook, like a use resource hook, because I've been wanting to do that in like the last 3 projects I've written. And I think it would be a really good, like really cool thing that you can do after you've gone through the work of the 4 videos and understand all the moving pieces, you know, because it's a lot of boilerplate.
Yep. Now with like the hook, is this something you could see? You could see you swapping out the data library underneath it. So you have use resource, but then you can use like SWR or what's the other one?
React Query. Yeah. Tanner Lindsay, React Query. I think so. Yeah, I think so. And so it would be interesting because I want to play around with it obviously first and see what API would feel good. But like, yeah, it's just a lot of wiring, and really all you need is like, you know, use resource, and you need a way to create a resource and then save it. And so there's a couple ways you could go about doing it. Like the Ember Data OOP way would be like, I can always just call like, you know, create me a to-do resource. And that's going to be linked to the API to-dos cache key somehow. So you could imagine like create resource, you take in a to-do, and then we have a convention in the app that like links that to the URL. And so it knows which like cache to update when you make something new and save it. So you could like create a to-do, and then you could call it to-do.save, right? And it would like update in the background and give you like a is saving flag. Or you could do like a use resource to-dos, and then you get back like a to-dos collection, and like maybe you get an add function, or like maybe you call to-dos.add or something like that. Some way to like add an optimistic, you know, object to the client-side cache. and then you have some way to like save it. But basically all like the Redux like code is like what you want to abstract away, because like you don't want to be saying, oh, now I have to splice in to-dos with my temp ID. Now I need to like map and splat the old thing and then push this new item into the array. Like you don't want to do any of that stuff.
Yeah, boilerplate.
Super boilerplate. I'm really curious like what bigger teams have done with respect to their like data fetching code.
Okay.
You're scared?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's not like some secret that a big team has.
Well, I think it's like the first thing I would reach for abstracting, because it's like, dude. So this is one of the things I want to talk about, was just like optimistic UIs are so powerful and great, but like they also add so much stuff. So
I mean, there's a whole new state.
There's many new states. There's many new states. So like if you have a to-do, the video shows like a to-do app, and you know, when you basically click on a new to-do field and type in something and hit enter, then like the world freezes while the thing is saving. Not completely freezes, but like the to-do input is disabled and the save is occurring, and then when it comes back, it's appended to the list. So it's kind of like approximating that like server rendered web app experience with JavaScript, which, you know, is just one way to do it. It's simple. There's like effectively two states. Now, even in that world, the UI is still like a concurrent environment. So like while that thing is saving, like the user could click on one of the other to-dos. You could disable the entire list and force them into like a waiting state in essence. But they can always click the back button. They can always click refresh. They can always click on another route in the nav, unless you literally like freeze the entire UI. So like JavaScript UI developers do have to deal with concurrency like from the beginning. Obviously, that's like one of the things that makes our job hard. But when you go from this like, okay, I have a new to-do is blank, new to-do is filled, new to-do is saving, and then like the new to-do is appended. That's like the four states you have. And then you go into like optimistic UI. So what do you have? Well, now you have new to-do is filled, blank and filled. Then you hit enter and you save it. So now you have a new temporary to-do, you know, a client side to-do, like optimistic to-do. And that's in the list. So now your UI is back to the initial state. You have a temporary to-do in your global collection that's being rendered alongside your other canonical server rendered to-dos. But there's a save happening. So now just in if you stop doing everything, you now have like, the temporary to-do is in the list while the save is happening. The temporary to-do is in the list after the save was successful. The temporary to-do is in the list after the save failed. And then if it's successful, you have like the two states where it's like there's a temporary to-do there, and then you want to replace it with the canonical to-do from the server. So like right there, you have like four different things that can happen just by making an optimistic UI. And then add that to the mix that the person could start adding a second temporary to-do in the middle of all these states.
Yep. Yeah, it's basically all the states that you originally had duplicated because you have them all also while the to-do is saving.
I mean, it's really like it's more like a product because of any of the temp to-dos, because they can save in parallel. You have like multiplicative states.
Yep.
You have like three temp to-dos, and any of them could be in any of the three states or whatever. Four states,
yeah, I guess,
you know?
I guess you can imagine like one to-do failing to save as like a nice little error message, like to-do blah, 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 couldn't be saved. But what happens if like one to-do succeeds and two to-dos fail? Like that, do you display like three notifications, like two errors, one success? It's just, yeah, it's hard.
That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. It almost feels like when you're at that point, you want to start going for the log thing. So at least you have it in like a sequential order in the way that the user has done it, so that you know it's valid, and you can like roll back and forward in a single linear log, as opposed to like, wait, they published the lesson, but like the update to title failed, and now you're in like a totally invalid state. You know what I mean?
Yeah, even though like these three to-dos are independent of each other, just you forcing them to be like if the second one fails, we don't even try the third one until you correct the second one. That at least makes your life a little easier as a developer.
Right. Totally. So maybe there's a nice way to do that where like you have that log and you debounce it. Oh, I have to get this real quick.
What kind of food you get?
I just got like my meal delivery. So he gives me like 4 containers of food for the next 2 days.
Nice.
Hashtag New York life. Anyways, so yeah, you could do like a log of actions, of operations, and maybe you could like debounce them or something so that they all go over in a certain time. Or if you get one, if the server gets one without getting the previous one, it like rejects it or something like that.
Yeah, you know, we talked about logux, I think, a few weeks ago, but one of the things I really liked about it was even though I'm persisting the log to the server, as a developer, I don't think about that.
Right.
I'm just writing to the local Redux store.
Right.
And then that all those actions are then ending up on the server. So in a sense, I feel like it made it easier because I didn't have to, if you buy that the whole UI is optimistic,
right,
I didn't have to deal with like that is saving state. Now, I guess I did in the sense that like if I had to show an icon,
right,
I think in your video you do that, but I didn't have any of that stuff.
Right.
So I guess I took kind of like the easy, simple path there.
No, but it's good to think about, and it's pretty interesting to think about like there being an abstraction like that that actually makes this whole problem easier. You know, It's like the simple version with the pessimistic UI case is like straightforward. We can do that, but like you always have these edge cases, or like you're dependent on the network when you don't need to be. And yeah, it's cool to think of an abstraction that could really help there. Yeah, the use resource hook is interesting to me because I just feel like, yeah, there's a lot of boilerplate there. And it also got me thinking like the logix thing is interesting because logix is like framework independent, right?
Yeah.
And the data fetching stuff is like, is pretty interesting, and like a hook would be cool. But like, I was thinking, what would it look like to have a library that's not based on React, but that would be easy to integrate with React?
Yeah, I guess I feel like this should be abstracted from an app that we actually build. So I think it should start with React and then go to the general solution.
Right.
I guess that's like a way of saying like I have no idea what it would look like.
Yeah, but like I like that XState is not based on React and it has an integration. And it just, the reason I started thinking about this was because like, so Ember Data has so many of these good ideas, but they're just locked inside of Ember. And same with like a lot of things, right? Now I guess like MobX is that a React library, or does it have React bindings or whatever?
I don't know. I guess it has React bindings, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was just thinking that like it's just a bummer that,
you know, I would actually think that like most of these libraries we're going to talk about in the React world are probably not tied to React. If you think about like what React is, it's you know, the component layer, JSX, and a bunch of hooks. And so you could imagine like, you know, just using that hook layer as a what did you say? Bindings.
Bindings, yeah. It's easier to imagine the boundaries there.
Right. So I think one of the problems we get into with like Ember Data, where we can't imagine abstracting it, is that it depends on Ember object.
Right.
And that's maybe this is changing with like the newer Ember stuff. I don't know.
Right.
But yeah.
It just bums me out. I was also bummed out because I was talking with I had this back and forth on Twitter with Michael Jackson and Guillermo Rausch about caching and CDNs, and we went back and forth. You know, Michael's been. I like Michael. He's willing to kind of put out the iconoclastic, like contrarian perspective on like JAMstack, because like you know, JAMstack's just kind of it's like a useful term, but it's also a little bit like bloated or something. It's not as like well defined, I think, as a term as it could be. And you know, Michael's been programming for a long time, and was talking about how like he sets up CDNs with his projects, and like he runs unpackage, which is like a basically a proxy to like the npm registry that people point to in the way that we used to point to like script tags for jQuery. And of course you would need CDN layer with something like this because it's just like huge and it gets a ton of traffic, and it works out really well because NPM packages are like immutable. So you put a new version of like Mirage up and you can request it with unpackage.com. And once you request version 0.32, like it's just there. You can put it on the edge basically. But the server is dynamic. It's not a JAMstack site in the sense that it's not generate at build time.
Right. They don't rebuild a new registry every time someone publishes a new package.
Exactly. Which would be ridiculous, and it's not even desirable. So I like it because he's just sometimes will put out there like, only JAMstack can use the CDN. Like to use a CDN, you need JAMstack. Like if you want to deploy to the edge, you gotta get on the JAMstack. And it's like, that's not true. So the back and forth was interesting, and Guillermo, I think his point was more that you can use a CDN to deploy your app to servers around the world for any app, but you have to configure it yourself. And if you are able and willing to abide by the constraints of JAMstack, then companies like Vercel, Zeit, and Netlify will be able to do that for you.
Okay.
Because sometimes people in the Netlify and JAMstack and Zeit space speak as if it's a completely new paradigm. And really, I think what I took away from the back and forth was that it's a new set of constraints that defines something that is able to be deployed to the edge easily, and as opposed to being a brand new paradigm.
I see. And what is this? Is this specifically the build step? Like the build step acts as an invalidator? Like is that?
Basically, I think so. Yeah, I think so. So like if every artifact of your build that generates a static asset can basically be deployed on the CDN. And like the way we have been doing it in Ember for literally like 6 years, is like all of the assets that change, which is like the JavaScript and the CSS bundles, those are fingerprinted, and on every time you run Ember build or whatever, you get unique assets. So they're immutable. And so as we talked about like a long time ago in this podcast, like when it comes to caching, I think this was about the APIs are about policy episode, is that like when we realized like HTTP caching is kind of weird, right? It's because you either want it to be never expire or always expire, basically.
Right.
Like nothing in between makes sense, because that's kind of hand wavy. It can make sense for certain
for like
certain
four
setups.
things in the world.
Well, it can make sense for setups. There's an argument for using it to simplify certain things. But when you're talking about like what's the ideal, like theoretical ideal here of like it makes sense if you have like my vendor.js or my React app.js -12345 SHA, a GitHub SHA, like a hash, a unique hash. That's an immutable resource. So just go ahead and slap a never expires cache control header on it, and boom, you can put it on a CDN, and you can do that very easily, like we do with EmberMap, like we've done with every Ember app we've written for like 5 years, which is just like enable Cloudflare, right?
CloudFront. But yes, and this goes way before SPAs as well. Right. Like this is just static assets. They're static. They don't change. And so you can do never expires and literally put the identifier, the MD5 of the file in the file name.
Right.
And so that way it's just, you never need to worry about expiration.
Right. The reason I think it started becoming more top of mind for like front-end developers and app developers like in the last 5 to 10 years is because we were making app bundles like we were with Ember and other frameworks, where it's like you realize, oh wait, we can cache the entire app, all the code for it. Whereas like in a Rails app, you have to make a request and generate it from a server at runtime, typically is how it works. So we kind of went through this whole innovation process back in like 2014 and 2015. And the one sticking point was the index.html file, because when you type in www.facebook.com, you are requesting the same thing. And of course that changes over time, since that's like the bootstrapping file that references the immutable resources. But once you push a new deploy, that thing is going to reference different resources. So then the question becomes, how can we deliver that fast?
Right. And also even if you're not building an SPA, that thing has dynamic content, right? So it's like literally uncacheable, whether you're building an SPA or not.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So then in the Ember community, the answer was you don't want to cache it. Like you would not want to put a cache. You could do it. You can add a cache control to like an index.html file. And the problem is like your user's devices are now going to like hold on to that really tight, and you won't be able to get push them new updates, because basically when you set a cache control header of like anything other than like never always expires, now you're putting power in the hands of the user's device to determine when the best time to invalidate is, right?
Yeah.
And
you can also do a cache control header and not serve it to the user, but it's a header that's just used by the CDN. But the problem is that the CDN, the edge node, is going to, just like the user's device, is going to hold on to that copy literally forever because it doesn't expire. So you have to come up with some invalidation strategy.
Right.
And you know, you like with CloudFront, we do have invalidation. Right. I can like press a button that invalidates index. I think even in like the Ember deploy thing, there is a setting. There's a CloudFront, what do they call them? Deploy plugins.
Yeah, Ember CLI deploy plugin. Yeah,
that will let you cache index and then expire it on every single deploy. The issue there is that this isn't really like CloudFront isn't made for this sort of thing, and invalidations can take 20 minutes. So you know, there's
we didn't end up doing that. What we ended up doing is serving the index from origin, basically.
Correct. And part of this was that invalidation phase taking so long.
Right. There's companies like Fastly that we could have wired up that are better about this.
Yes.
And so if we had unlimited resources and we wanted to make it faster, that would be one way to go.
Yep.
Also, our index page for each route in the site will change more frequently than we deploy, because they have runtime data in them that we can pre-render, but we can do it on demand. So when we do cache our index pages for our routes, we just do it in our node server that's deployed. So it's not served at the edge. It could be, but it's not right now, for simplicity.
Right. And that's what you're bringing up right now. The fact that we have runtime stuff is why I think the server side app and the SPA, I don't think matters in this discussion, because it's the index applies the same way to both of those.
Right. Say that again.
So a lot of times we talk about this stuff like, oh, in the context of an SPA or in the context of a server side app. But I think when we're talking about caching index.html, the fact that you're writing an SPA or a server-side rendered app, it actually doesn't matter. They both have this problem, and the problem is that you have one entry point, you can't hash it, and that entry point has dynamic content,
right,
and therefore you can't cache it. And so, so the underlying, I don't want to say the underlying architecture, but what kind of app you're writing doesn't matter for this problem. It's a problem that you have a single entry point and the thing is not cacheable.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. So we generate we do cache our index in
we
Node.
don't. I mean,
we can pre-generate it in essence, and we can invalidate it when a video has changed if a particular page depends on that video. So it's cached in the sense that I can ask you for the cached for what the HTML response is for the current homepage right now, and I don't need a server. Like I don't need to go to origin necessarily. Well,
we cache the output of fastboot because it takes a while to generate. Yeah. So but cache is a weird term, right? Because you have different layers of cache. On one end, you have like the CDN cache, which is edge node saving content and serving them. On the other side, you have like the app server cache, which is I have an expensive thing to render. Yeah. Can you just save it so that next time I don't have to pay the expense? So
we're in that bucket, and Rails
app server.
Russian doll caching also falls in that bucket.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if we wanted to, though, correct me if I'm wrong, we could take that output and put it on Fastly and deploy it around the world. And then let's say Fastly gives us a guarantee of like 5-second invalidation time. Every time we could set up a mechanism such that when our surrogate keys changed, we would send a message to Fastly to invalidate it, and then we could regenerate it and re-upload it.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, you know, kind of like what you were talking about earlier with the hooks and the abstractions, I think Fastly does offer some great abstractions here with Rails. So you can say like, whenever a model of this type is saved, just invalidate it on Fastly.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that you're probably going to drive at here is that still a lot to set up. And it's
exactly.
Like,
so
you have to have like a deep ops knowledge.
Yes. So this is like what I think the angle Guillermo's coming from. And I felt like it doesn't always come through when folks are talking about JAMstack because, again, they talk about it as if it's a completely new thing, when in reality, it's a set of constraints in the same way that the 12-factor app was a set of constraints around Rails apps, such that if you built an app in this way, we can now take it and deploy it anywhere and scale it up and give you zero downtime deploys and all of these great benefits that fall out of the constraints, right?
Yep. Awesome point. Yeah, because like deploying web apps to servers was nothing new when that 12-factor paper or whatever website came out.
Yeah.
But yeah, it changed exactly how we think about deploys. So,
yeah. So JAMstack is really a set of constraints. And so, okay, let's keep going, because tying it back to what we were saying, which is like we cache the output of fastboot because it's slow, and then we could eventually cache it. But like in our case, in our website's case, and many websites' cases, if a page is dynamically generated, the invalidation is not actually tied to a deploy. It's tied to database changes. So with JAMstack, you can. It's almost like you want to make this point, which is, if you are making a site that you are willing to tie invalidation to your deploys, then you can get a massively simple architecture, because you no longer have this difference between, oh, we're deploying new assets, and so we need to re-fingerprint them and upload them, and those go to the CDN. But then our homepage is generated on this other schedule, and so now we have to have a different mechanism for invalidating the cache. JAMstack says if you can take as much of your content of all your assets, and if it's okay to only redeploy and rebuild the generated content when you're actually deploying new code, then we can do it all together, and we have one really simple way to invalidate everything about the app, and then one really simple way to cache everything about the app. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So it's basically saying like the more code that you run on the client. So if you move all your dynamic stuff to the client, like if you want to fetch the data for the homepage, because that's the data that changes. If you fetch that on the client and render it on the client, then all the stuff on the server can stay cached.
I wasn't even getting to that spot yet. I was saying,
okay,
let's say you're fetching your data from Contentful or CMS, and you just do it Gatsby style at build time. So from all intents and purposes, you've turned the runtime problem into you've taken it out of the picture.
I know, I get this, but I don't like this as a talking point, because a lot of people's reactions are going to be like, well, I can't do that. People update the content on my homepage every 5 minutes. I can't run a deploy.
I agree that that's the more interesting use case and common one, but I think it's good to split out all the different things. Like if you're building a site like samselkoff.com, which has no dynamic content right now, then it's an okay constraint, and it's basically a static site, and so it's nothing new. Like it's a static site the same way it was a static site 20 years ago or whatever.
Right. You just have better tools today.
You just have way better tools, and you have a clear understanding that let's say I want to pull in my latest tweets, right? Then I think Nala just tried to open the door. I just noticed a slit.
Hold on one second.
Okay, you take care of it. Let's see if the viewers can watch little Miss Nala coming in. That's Nala is Ryan's Shiba Inu, and she loves her daddy.
Hey, I gotta go in like 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Let's let's wrap this one up. And
there's a lot more to say. So
Yeah.
do you want to like just,
you want to just pick it up later?
yeah, I think so. Cause there's,
Okay. Where we left off is that you have samselkoff.com and it's all static, good to go, JAMstack approved, edge deployed very easily. Like that's really what we're talking about. How easy is it to deploy your code to the edge?
Yes.
Let's say I want to bring in my latest tweets. If I am willing to do that in such a way, let's say that it updates every day. Again, if you are able to work within the constraints of a statically generated site, I can hit a real-time API at build time and just tell my site to rebuild every day. And so that's like this gradation. That's like this slow movement where it's like I have fresh-ish data on my site that is still abiding by the constraints of being generated at build time, and therefore it's still going to be edge deployed easily. So,
but the tweet thing, it just requires you to know that you're not going to tweet every 5 minutes.
Well,
right?
or you're okay with the data being stale by 1 day or 5 hours or whatever. The point is is not to say that you should do this. The point is that if you are able to abide by these constraints, and there are creative ways to get farther than you would think in this build time statically generated world, especially with the tools we have today, like Gatsby. Like maybe before you had Gatsby in a content mesh, you wouldn't even be able to conceive of like, oh no, I have my data in an API behind Contentful. Like there's no, how could I possibly get it at build time? Like the amount of work required is insane. Whereas now it's like installing a Gatsby plugin. So there is this, in the Venn diagram, there is a portion of it that is, that's like you can actually take some data that you would think would need to be generated at runtime by a server and turn it into build time responses. So again, it's not the interesting case, and it's not most apps, but that is just another layer of this. If you can do that, then you can still easily deploy to the edge, right?
Right. I just, there's something that's just doesn't sit with me with this sort of architecture, that it just requires you to know that this is going to be fine forever. And that's, for some things like my personal blog, that's fine. But, well, a website that you're building for work is,
I mean, potentially Ember Map could fall. This is the thing. The question is, why are you deploying it to the edge in the first place? And the answer is so that it's really fast for the user.
I got to run. Let's pick
this up next week. Okay. All right. So we felt like the conversation yesterday was too hot to just to cancel it and put it off.
Yeah. Hey, I want to ask, do you want to like start over? Because there was like a lot of jumping.
Let's pick up where we were. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we decided that our conversation yesterday was too good to just let it hang, that massive cliffhanger for another week. So here we are. It's Wednesday. We're gonna pick it back up. We're gonna try to get this thing out Thursday, but hopefully kind of finish the conversation here.
Yeah. So where'd we leave off?
So let's try to remember. We were talking about caching. We were talking about edge deploys. We were talking about a purely static site, and how the constraints of JAMstack let you take advantage of CDNs easily. And we started with a purely static site, a completely static site that was just static files. And then we moved on to the next level. So that's what we were talking about. We're trying to come up with a taxonomy, right? And on one end is, static HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that can be cached easily and served by any content server. And I think the next step up is like a dynamic site, but that can be generated at build time. So for the purposes of caching, you're basically in the same boat as you were with the purely static site. And you were kind of pushing back and saying like, I don't like this idea because it's like not really dynamic.
Yeah, it's well, I guess there's two problems with it. One is like, just the way caching works. You can't just rebuild your app and magically you get a brand new cache, right? There's infrastructure there. I think you're going to address that. And then the other is that it's really hard to know that you can just build your app can be a build time app. Like you can't.
Right. I think that's the more interesting question. And so it's like, though I do think tools like Gatsby have shown that there are more apps that can be invalidated at build time than you would previously think. If you would previously build a site like EmberMap, you would say, well, yeah, it's a database-driven site, right? But then in reality, if you make it easy enough to statically generate, then it actually doesn't need to be runtime database-driven, right?
Yeah. Also, too, I think there's certain websites that parts of the website are, dynamic runtime, and the other parts can be build time. Like even something like GitHub, where you can imagine there's a number of repos that could be generated at build time, but there's tons of repos in that really long tail that would have to be runtime. So
right, like they don't need to regenerate the complete React GitHub repo page, because it's going to be there. It's been there for years. And it's going to be there for years or whatever. Yeah. But one thing that I did is kind of interesting. We're picking up this conversation in between yesterday and today because I was tweeting a little bit about this as I was thinking more about it once we kind of hung up. Was the bit about just clarifying what JAMstack means from a useful perspective. And we had kind of started this earlier in this conversation about the 12-factor app architecture. And I think that turns out to be a better analog to JAMstack than something like JAMstack is to mean stack. That's the problem with JAMstack is that it has the word stack in it. And so you think it's a stack because that's what it's called. And you think about something like mean stack or PHP, patch, whatever that one was.
Lamp.
Yeah, lamp. And those stacks are specific choices of technology, whereas JAMstack is about an architecture. So the 12-factor app, again, just to reiterate what we were talking about in the conversation yesterday, is like a set of constraints such that if you build your app in that way, you can take advantage of Heroku and get the features that Heroku offers. Yeah, it's not just about Heroku; it's about
cloud services.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
That was the main driver. It's you could do 12-factor, in 1990 before anyone was talking about the cloud, but cloud services were the thing that you could really take advantage of them if you followed these 12 rules of deploying an app.
Makes sense. So like basically once cloud services became more and more popular, we realized what constraints we needed to impose on our application architecture such that we could easily take advantage of them.
Yep.
But like you said, we could still make a 12-factor app in 1990. It just didn't matter as much.
Yeah. And if you were, thinking about the tying this into JAMstack, if you're building, like if you were like a 1990s developer and you see 12-factor, you would look at this and be like, well, how does this help me? I already have a way to configure my app. I already have a way to get the source of my app, whatever the 12 things are. Mm-hmm. But it's about, okay, what if you need to deploy your app to 50 new servers in the next hour? Right. And that's something that, we weren't talking about before cloud services.
Right. And so in the same way, really JAMstack, while you could have built websites that are adhere to the constraints of JAMstack that are static and use JavaScript or whatever, fingerprinted assets, whatever, you could have been doing that for the last 30 years. But it wasn't until the recent conversations around static deploys and CDNs where it was like, okay, why would I do this? Why would I, like making a database-driven Rails app is much simpler in so many ways because invalidation is taken care of. It's like never stale data, all this stuff. Why would I do it with a JAMstack architecture? And the answer is so that you can easily take advantage of like CDNs, let's just say. That's like really the point.
Yep.
So it really makes sense to me to think more about it like that. And I wish it was talked about like that as opposed to saying WordPress is not a JAMstack site because that's not how we talk about 12-factor apps. But that's like on the homepage of jamstack.org or whatever.
Interesting. Yeah, great. I want to go back to... so like 12-factor is definitely sort of like a best practice, if you will. And what did you say? You said mean stack. That's definitely like an application. It's a stack.
Right.
JAMstack feels somewhere in between because when I think of 12-factor, I think like whether I have a Ruby, Python, or Java app, these apply to me. But with JAMstack, like, do I need to be using something like Gatsby or Next when I talk about this?
Yeah, good question. So let's try to unravel and like get away from the JAMstack thing and talk about what the actual benefits and constraints are. So the benefits are really the CDN is the idea. They say like no servers needed. Like what they mean is no application servers. What they mean is like you have a part of your app or most of your app or all of your app that boils down to static files. So even Next and Netlify won't say you should never make an API call from your React code to make your app dynamic. And so then the question becomes, well, like whatever data my use fetch is calling is not deployed on the edge, or it's not part of my static bundle. And so
it's not even part of my app. Like I could be fetching from another source.
Yeah. So I think it's a better way to think about it is that it's really a continuum in the sense that you're asking the question from the beginning, how much of my app can I force into this box such that it will be easier and simpler to deploy. It'll be faster to the end user. It'll be CDNifiable.
Yeah.
Right. So that to me is really, like you said, like that's where it is actually different from 12-factor, because you can point to an app and ask, is it 12-factor or not, which I think is nice. Whereas with JAMstack and this stuff, you're really asking the question, how much of this is architected in such a way that it can be easily deployed to a CDN via services that have no other idea about your infrastructure or architecture setup like Netlify and now. And so that was where part of the interesting Twitter conversation with Michael Jackson was coming, where he was saying, look, we've been using the CDN for 2 decades, and I can put a CDN in front of, I can add Fastly to a Rails site. You can do that. You can choose to invalidate it once a month. You can set up a hook that invalidates it when the database changes. You send a message to Fastly, and you're going to have exactly the same performance as if you put a Jekyll site together and put it directly on Netlify. But the point is, like, those things that your app has to do to enable the CDN, let's say like in a Rails app, you have to know that when a model changes, that invalidates these 5 pages. Well, now you can't really tell Netlify now that in an easy way. You'd have to configure that. Whereas if I have a Next app or a Gatsby site or a Jekyll site or something that has a Yarn build, now all of a sudden these services can opaquely deploy my app to the edge without having to know anything else. So I think that's more of like the important point.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is a good time to bring it up, but there are things you can do when you're building your app that make that easier, right? That make that invalidation phase easier. Basically, the more dynamic data that your server is generating and the CDN is delivering, that makes invalidation hard, because you have to come up with a way to invalidate it. And so one of the things that I like about this whole whatever next JAMstack approach that we're talking about is that it nudges you towards the client fetching the dynamic data and the build process generating static assets. And so there is actually less to invalidate. So you don't have to think about what happens when my database changes. How do I
invalidate my JavaScript?
Yeah.
Because that's taken care of by the fact that you're fingerprinting your JavaScript, for example. So you've separated those two things.
Right. And I think yesterday you talked about like displaying a list of tweets and doing that at build time is one of the things. But also too, like you could embed tweet.js, Twitter's JavaScript API onto your page. And when your tweets change, you don't need to invalidate your deploy because you're using their service. So I think you get nudged towards, okay, I'm going to build the things that don't change, deploy those to the CDN, cache them, and then the client is going to fetch the things that do change. And that just makes my life so much easier, right? That lets me CDN deploy and not worry about invalidation.
Right. So yeah, it's a spectrum, because like both Gatsby and Next have ways for you to fetch data on the server, runtime data, but then decide to cache it for a certain amount of time. Let's say the first time you request the data, it's not in the cache, so the function runs on the server, and then they put it in a cache for you. And then the question becomes, again, how do I invalidate? And so you can either say, even though this is coming from a service, I'm going to treat it as if it is immutable for the length of this deploy, or I'm going to treat it as immutable for a day, and then invalidate after a day of time, because that trade-off is worth it for this particular site. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, but I don't. In my mind, there's like server apps could do that, and they can do that. That's not like a big ask for them to do. I was going to say like they can do that easily, but maybe not.
Yeah, you have to know. It's like you said yesterday. You have to have deep ops knowledge. You have to know how to even something like caching index.html and then purging it on Fastly. Like you have to know you can do that. It's not as easy out of the box as it is for the immutable assets like the JavaScript and CSS.
Sure, but yeah, that seems like an easier hill to conquer than the hill of getting not only having your app build static things and letting the client do the dynamic things.
Yeah, but I think the conversation should be centered on, like, because it's a spectrum and both the static things and the dynamic things change. That's the thing where that's where some of this conversation gets a little muddy, because it's like, yeah, your assets are immutable, but they change every time you deploy. The question is like, what's the best invalidation strategy? And the point with JAMstack is that if you build static assets, we have a very simple, battle-tested way to invalidate assets, and that's by making them immutable and giving them a fingerprint. Boom, you've just taken care of it, right? And
but that's not the
and then the question becomes, how do you invalidate other parts of the app that are not the source code in the JavaScript and the CSS? So then it becomes things like, well, index.html, the HTML document is a separate category because it's not immutable. It's not. It's the same resource requested that changes. So it's a mutable resource. So now we need a new strategy for invalidating that. And then when it comes to things like data that's coming from different sources, we have to ask the question, how best to invalidate that? And so the point with like Gatsby's content mesh is like, because we have this battle-tested, well-understood way of invalidating our assets, if you take all the data you need to power your site, and if you can draw a circle around some of it that is okay to invalidate along with the code, then you've just saved yourself a lot of hassle, because it's very easy to do that. And that's how a lot of people use parts of their data, like making a blog on a personal website. It's the same thing. You see what I'm saying? That is something that you should consider. If you can do that, like we could make Ember Map like that potentially. Like we might get frustrated and then want to be able to see changes immediately and not have our data tied to our deploys. But you could imagine, for example, starting out like that, and it simplifies a lot of things because you get to use one invalidation strategy for everything.
Yeah, I get that, but I think there's something deeper here, because imagine a world with which JavaScript doesn't exist. Like JavaScript's never invented. We can still do the strategy that you're talking about, right? Nothing you're talking about here is related to JavaScript. We could build with, whatever, some new language, Ruby, and ship everything, invalidate our CDNs, and however they get new data, We can hand wave that away. But like we still think of the things as like, this is static, it's build time. And, there's just like, there's no,
but if you have a new Rails app, you're not thinking like this. You're not thinking about generating new versions of index.html for each time you deploy.
But you could like,
yeah, you could, and if you do it, you get to take advantage of this really simple invalidation strategy. But the point that's what I'm saying. The point of JAMstack, to me, just thinking out loud, trying to unpack this, the point is like, look, there's this really easy way to invalidate things. If you use a tool that gives you as much of your app in that form as possible, now we have a really easy way to do that, and you can use services that take advantage of that fact. Which is why you can't deploy a Rails app on Netlify to the edge.
but it still asks a question of okay, but I have dynamic data.
Yeah, of course, it begs the question that you have other parts of the site that don't.
And I think this is where JAMstack actually has an answer to this. They can say, okay, the clients run the dynamic data. Like the clients fetch the dynamic data.
So then, but ultimately, right. Okay. So again, I still think I think it's important to draw a circle around the parts of the app that fall in that category, because there are lots of parts of the app, or there's parts of the app, but there's parts of the app that fall in that category. It'll be a different percentage of the parts for different sites, right?
Yeah, I guess this is like where we disagree, because I don't think you can. I think like, yeah, I can draw the circle 6 years later when I look at the app, and I can be like, oh yeah, that thing was actually would have been fine to generate at build time. But I think when you're developing an app, you can't.
Well, if we're developing an app, I can tell you right now 100% certainty that the JavaScript and CSS should fall into this bucket.
Okay.
So, right, and images, static images that are in the source code, and fonts and other assets that are in the source.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And then as soon as we hit like dynamic data
but hold on. But the reason I think it's important is because even though that's all true at a Rails app, we have not been deploying those parts of a Rails app to the edge, have we?
Yeah, I mean, a Rails app deploys its assets to
CDNs.
CDN, yeah.
If you set it up.
Yeah. I mean, but it's there's like Capistrano. It's like 2 lines of code.
Wait. Hold on.
No.
I feel like you're backpedaling on what you said yesterday. I've never used Capistrano, so to me, that's not going to be something I'm going to do when I Rails new and push to Heroku. You see what I'm saying? Whereas that's part of why this is an important conversation, because if I create a new Next app and push to now, then I do get that for those pieces. Whereas if I create a new Rails app and push to Heroku, I don't. And the question is why? And the answer, I think, is because we are being more clear about what the boundaries are, right?
Sure, but I don't. I'm gonna like. I kind of agree with you, but I want to push back because I don't. This is so very like for a Rails developer. This is very easy for them to do. I kind of think it's like,
just lack
it's
of
like you're picking. Yeah, exactly. You're picking on like a very newbie Rails developer, and I can find a newbie JavaScript developer that is making, that's not architecting an app like this.
Okay, so the question is like, is an app like that a JAMstack app, a JAMstack site?
No.
Why?
Because it needs to go to origin for dynamic data.
Hold on, I feel like we're talking past each other, because let's say that you
the reason it's not a JAMstack site, at least my interpretation of this, is that in order to get any data for a web page, you have to make a request to the server app.
Not if it's static in the HTML in the assets that are cached by a CDN, the way you just said a good Rails developer would set up.
Well, the Rails developer is going to cache the assets, so the images, the CSS, JavaScript, but they're not going to cache the HTML. Like they're going to have a thing that's like /user/1, and that thing can change. And sure, they can set up Fastly, but that's where the ops knowledge and the you have to really think about what you're doing.
Okay, but that's what I was trying to get at, though, because that index, that HTML is cached if you create a new Next app and deploy it to now.
Okay, but this is
so is that what makes a Hello World Next app a JAMstack site, and it doesn't make a Hello World Rails app a JAMstack site?
No, because again,
the answer is no one knows.
No. The answer is no, and I want to build up to here, but the answer is no, because in a world without JavaScript, you could imagine having this strategy. You could imagine building a static site in Ruby and deploying it to the CDN, and having imagine like Middleman was as popular as SPA architecture was. Like someone would invent a Netlify for Middleman.
No, but Middleman does work on Netlify.
Okay. Perfect. So
that's the point.
That's not JAMstack. It's not.
Why? Yes, it is. It's literally on the homepage of JAMstack.
Did I just get owned there?
Yes, I think you did, buddy. JAMstack.
But why? I don't consider
Jekyll,
that.
Hugo, Next, Gatsby.
Okay,
or another static site generator.
I wouldn't consider Jekyll I look at Jekyll and Next is very, very different because Next has the ability to have the client fetch data.
What is the JAMstack? You may have already seen or worked on a JAMstack site. They do not have to include all attributes of JavaScript APIs and markup. They might be built using sites built by hand or with Jekyll, Hugo, Next, Gatsby, or another static site generator. The thing that they all have in common is that they don't depend on a web server.
Okay. Well, in that case, then yes, the static site generator is a JAMstack site.
What about a Rails app set up with Fastly for caching HTML?
I mean, it depends on the server. So I think
this
the
is
answer
stupid
there.
to me, man. I think this is really like dumb.
Hold on. But there is another level here that
yes.
we can get to. So yeah, I agree. When you read that description, like I look at something like Jekyll and Middleman is fundamentally different than Next and Gatsby. And I want to get to like why that is.
Yeah, I want to understand that too, because I don't know if I agree, because in a Jekyll site, you could make an AJAX request with some JavaScript.
Sure.
And a Gatsby site can be purely static.
Sure. And you can do that in a Rails app too, but just developers don't. I mean, that's like a very special architecture if you have.
Well, our Gatsby site from MirageJS.com is basically what it would be if it was Jekyll.
Yep.
So
yeah. So I don't consider that a JAMstack site. But I guess I'm wrong. So I need a new term here.
Yeah. I think let's set aside JAMstack for now and just talk about what is actually meaningfully different between the tools, right?
Yeah.
So I think
I think the dynamic content is where is the wedge.
The rubber hits the road.
Yeah, and I think that's where the next solution is so beautiful.
Well, okay, but before we go there though, because I want to understand this, because I think just like in economics, like when you first learn about things in economics, you talk about like Robinson Crusoe on an island when you're talking about like demand and supply and savings and investment, not because it's like super realistic, but it's because it's a very simplified case. So even if the real world is never like Robinson Crusoe on an island, you can understand things like opportunity cost and the fact that like if he wants to grow the economy, he needs to like abstain from consumption, save fish. He'll be hungry for a little bit. But he's using that to finance the investments so that he can like actually take time away from fishing exactly what he needs every day and go build a net and increase his production, right? So you can learn it in that simple sense and then apply the lessons in the real world. And then the same way, we can focus on a static site here, even though most sites have dynamic content.
Does the island have a CDN on it? That's all. That's all I want to know.
So, okay, meaningful differences. So if you have a Rails app, a service like Now, basically it seems like this comes down to this comes down to the HTML, because the JavaScript and CSS is the same strategy on everything. Like we've been deploying Ember apps for 6 years, and the assets have been fingerprinted by Ember Build and invalidated by Cloudflare. Not even invalidated; they're immutable, so there's no invalidation required. Basically, if you have immutable assets, you don't need invalidation. So the question becomes, when you're looking at the simplest case of a static site, the only mutable artifact of that build is the HTML, right?
Yep.
Okay, and so if I'm doing then the question becomes, how do you invalidate that? And so with a tool like Gatsby, the answer is when you build, or Jekyll or Middleman. And with Rails, the answer is it depends. It depends. Well, basically, the HTML could only depend on code. Let's say it was a static marketing page, in which case the answer would be when you deploy, when you push new code. That's if it's not backed by a database at all. Otherwise, if the HTML is backed by a database, then the answer becomes you invalidate when the database changes. And that is enough dynamism such that tools like Now and Netlify cannot automatically deploy the HTML to a CDN and then invalidate it without extra configuration. Mm-hmm. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, it does. I was going to say, even like just like using your island example, like don't even bring in technology here. Like you have HTML files. How do you generate them? Like there is build time, so deploy. There is runtime, so when a request comes in, right, and then okay, how do you cache those two? Well, the build time one is pretty easy to cache. You just cache it and throw it away when you get a new build. And
yeah, you invalidate it when you get a new build. Yeah.
The runtime one is like, okay, we can hand wave and we can come up with Fastly and make it cacheable, but that's whatever we say there, it's still
more complicated.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I think maybe this is the unique thing here, is that in a world of Jekyll, HTML generated is top to bottom, the entire thing. It's the content. The HTML you get from the server looks like what you see in the browser. In Rails app, it's the same thing. That's generated at runtime HTML. It's going to be the same thing. Now, the unique thing about these JAMstack sites is that you can get, and even Ember, like basically the unique thing about like SPAs or JavaScript apps is that you can tease apart the static and dynamic parts of the HTML in essence. And therefore, you can have part of it that is immutable for the length of the deploy, and part of it that is mutable and depends on runtime data. And so now we are able to use the simple model for more and more of the HTML.
Bingo, exactly. And I'm just gonna say this, but I think it's really only Next that nicely hits this point. I don't think you can do this with Ember. I think with Ember you cannot.
Yeah, because it's intertwined with the data fetching in the same way that a Rails app is intertwined with the data fetching. That's how you code the templates.
Yes.
Whereas when you're doing Gatsby or Next, you're thinking about there's like the different hooks that run separately, or I guess really, if you server render a create React app,
same
effects don't run. No, but if the effects don't run, but if you can pre-render it, then you could cache part of the HTML, right? And then it just hydrates.
Yes. And this is what I think this is what I consider the Next model. Like when I talk about Next, this is what they nudge you to more than other frameworks do. So while you can do all this in Create React App,
what you're saying, Create React App is more like Ember and not like Next? I was saying that if Create React App ignores use effect on the server and it gives you a good chunk of the HTML, is it farther along that spectrum?
Yeah, I guess you're right, because you could pre-render all those pages, and you're left with literally static. Sorry, I'm tripping up my own words. I guess that this is a constraint. You need to pre-render your pages, and if you can end up with static HTML that is cacheable, then you've hit the sweet spot here. So and you can do that in Create React App. So it's unfair for me to say I can't do it.
It's just the architecture and the nudging, though. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like now coming back to the 12-factor app and the services you can take advantage of, like, okay, so Michael Jackson runs unpackage and he has a CDN in front of unpackage, but unpackage is extremely dynamic. So he's had to come up with his own invalidation strategy that is tied to the domain of his website. And he's done that and it works perfectly, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, is it JAMstack? Well, no, but is it on the CDN? Of course it is. It's like 99.9% cache hits on the CDN. So if JAMstack is about getting you to the CDN, the question is like, how does it do that? And so it's almost like, even if you have runtime data, if you can push that off until the end and do it on the client's device via JavaScript, you can now draw a circle around the parts of the code that you care about that are not dynamic, and that's just all taken care of for you. Yeah. And then even better, if you can delegate the dynamic parts to third-party services, which is where this kind of ties back to Heroku. Now maybe they have their own invalidation strategies. Maybe they can put databases around the world, and now you've like separated this problem of how do we invalidate things such that we can take advantage of global edge networks into these different pieces, and you can just focus on your code.
Yeah, I feel like the first thing you said is like the light bulb moment, and then you went right to the services.
I got more confused.
No. I think that's like the end goal. But so my whole complaint, this podcast is like, I can't statically generate my site because I don't know I can't tell you what is going to need to be dynamic, what's going to change a lot. Like the way developers work is we just expect everything to be dynamic. And if you told me I had to rebuild my site every time someone updates a row in a database,
Right.
I would say screw you.
Right.
And so, but the thing you highlighted is that if you can generate, like there are things on your website that are static.
Right.
That won't change. Like the header isn't going to change when someone updates a database row.
Right.
And so if you can draw circles around those things,
Right.
and have the client do all the fetching of the dynamic data, well, guess what? We just found some more things that are cacheable. Right. We just found some HTML that's cacheable, and that's
right.
That's a sweet spot because now me as a developer, I don't have to make this ridiculous trade-off of doing things at build time. I now have a runtime component in my architecture to fetch dynamic data.
Right.
So I think, I don't know. This is like a hill I want to die on. I think.
Yeah. No, it's good. I like it. I'm gonna keep letting it simmer. So like, yeah. I was just thinking about Ember because with Ember, it's like it's kind of interesting how you said that. Like we found more of our HTML, more of our templates, like more of our HTML that can be cached. In Ember, it's really like all of the parts of the HTML that can be cached are actually in the JavaScript in the form of like handlebars compiled bytecode. And so that's the instructions needed to render the parts of the HTML that are static, that are from code. And then the rest is coming from an API. So that's like a pure separation in a sense. And
I think with Ember, if we were going to like approach this with Ember, we'd have some way of like, it's the use effect thing from React is a really good parallel here. We'd have some way to pre-generate the pages in Ember, but any model hooks that fetch dynamic data would basically return like a null object
loading
pattern
or whatever. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Like you could imagine that. Yeah. They return like a null user. It looks like a user. It acts like a user, but it's enough that when I'm pre-rendering, it gives me enough information that I can write skeleton screens. So that, and then that output is all, it's all cacheable. And by the way, this is what I was considering JAMstack, but I guess,
yeah, well, this is why it's
it's not. I don't know.
This is why, like in that Twitter conversation, it was just kind of a little confusing with Guillermo because he was kind of saying like, cache is like a loaded term, or what does it actually mean? Incremental static generation. I kind of want to find this thing really quick because I was just curious.
While you look that up, I just want to say I think that the logical conclusion of this is how you ended your last thing, which is now you have all these services that are providing data, and since your client is fetching code, it's not even fetching code from your website, right? It's you're embedding tweet.js in your SPA, and you don't care about how tweets are invalidated because your SPA
it's not
is
your
cacheable.
Responsibility anymore.
Yeah. Your fetch call is cacheable. It's the result from your fetch call isn't cacheable, but that's something that Twitter handles.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And they're better at that than you'll ever be because they know how to best cache. Who's the best person in the world that knows how to cache tweets? It's Twitter.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point because even if you had this set up in your Rails thing, and we're talking about which cache invalidation strategy you want to use for different parts of your app, let's say you were using the Twitter API from the server on your Rails app. Now, how that is invalidated affects how you invalidate your whole app. Whereas if you push
your
off
whole page, any page, any page that displays a tweet is now invalid when when Twitter changes.
Yes, but if you push it off to the client device, then it just doesn't leak into your code at all anymore.
Yeah,
so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, this is my interpretation of what how Next is approaching.
It literally takes the tree that used to go like this, and all of the things that come in your server affect it. Like they all contaminate it, such that like the caching strategy infects. It's literally contagious. Like anytime you bring in a new service, if it becomes stale, then your whole page becomes stale. But once you push it to the device, these things are like no longer intertwined. They're all pointing to the device separately, and there's no path that goes through both of them. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now at the same time, Let me just look a little bit more here. I guess I got to the end of that. I didn't find it. It was something about that. Yeah, caching is not caching. This is not cache. Cache is not the right word because they're ephemeral and subject to slow, unavailable hits. It's distributed static file storage.
Yeah, sure.
There's an important distinction between your origin being a static file hosted in redundant storage, for example, S3, and a static file being inside a server that's very hard to make redundant. I'm writing a blog post about this because it trips people up. Maybe we'll go through it next time. But what was I going to say? So the only thing I want to wind back on here, not wind back, but like to challenge what we just said, which I think was a good thing, what we just said. But we often, so if it's true that if you push off data fetching until the end device, you decontaminate the staleness of a data from the staleness of the code and all the other assets. We often, when we build these things, we don't want our client apps to go to twitter.com. Like, we actually don't want our client apps to be talking to 5 different services directly from the browser. We usually use a reverse proxy for all sorts of reasons. So I guess at that point, that's fine though. That just means that those things contaminate your reverse proxies, like data API server, which is like separate from all this other stuff. So it's still good that it's separate, but now you just need to use those things. And I guess that if you just don't do any caching at all on that layer, then you just fall back to the caching of the services. It's just being made, it's just being initiated from your reverse proxy, and that's fine. Yeah. But you do need to go to like, it does mean you need to go to like origin in a sense.
Yeah. And that's a great point. We can even say like sometimes you need tweets and hacker news posts, and you actually have to do something that ties them together. Like you have to find all the words that are in both and blah blah blah. And that's might not be work that you want the client doing. Right. I guess if we like think really hard about this, then we can come up with some example where like the server becomes our client, blah, you know.
Yeah.
Somehow do work there.
Yeah.
But of course, if I just say like, oh, your entire app should be like static and then using third-party services, that similar to the argument I was making earlier, where it's impossible to know if your website is going to be fully static or fully dynamic. It's going to break down really quickly, and someone's going to say, okay, I can't just rely on services. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so basically, where are we at? JAMstack is about a subset. Everything in software is dynamic, otherwise it wouldn't be soft. So it's really about breaking up our software into different levels of dynamism. And there's a set of our software that is static enough that we call them static files. And if you can make the parts of more and more parts of your app static, then we have a really good strategy for delivering those to the edge and invalidating them, or maybe not even invalidating them because they're immutable. And really, JAMstack is about embracing that as much as possible for as much of your app as you can. Then the rest of the dynamic parts of the app are going to all have their own unique ways to invalidate and to distribute themselves as widely and as fast as possible. And that's going to look different for a MySQL database as it is for a Fauna database, as it is for a Twitter API, as it is for all these other things. And as those different things, you know, for example, for Cloudinary might be like, oh, what the data we provide is actually immutable because we know when you upload a new image on our site, that's when we change everything. So, whereas for S3, it might look different, blah, blah, blah. So all these things are going to have their own strategies. But for the most of us writing the code, if it's just, they fall into this bucket. It's very easy model to do it as immutable, fingerprinted deploys to CDN. So I still don't know what JAMstack means. I
thought I did before we started recording, but I could not have been more wrong. So
a Rails app, the interesting one is like a Rails app with Fastly in front of the HTML, but then has its own like invalidation for its database stuff, you know.
Yeah, at some point here, you do end up just like recreating Netlify, right? And then
are you JAMstack at that point? Like Embermap, Embermap has our own invalidation strategy for our pages. We have a surrogate key, and we can purge that, and we could put Fastly in front of our node cache.
I know, but there's too many. There's too many heads here. So like, yes, everything you just said is true, but then we don't deploy our HTML to a CDN, right?
But
so we could, but we don't.
We could enable Fastly in front of it.
Yeah.
But I guess we could.
there's a million things we could do.
Maybe JAMstack is like you're not set up so that you can easily take advantage of like of caching your HTML without like a lot of work. Maybe that's like at a very high level. Like, can a service like Netlify now easily cache your HTML? If so, you're JAMstack. If not, no, because like the assets are already taken care of, right?
I like that you're not set up. So I'm drawing this back to like the 12-factor thing, right? Like if I'm building a server pre 12-factor, I could be like, yeah, but I can deploy the cloud, right? I can use these tools.
Yes.
I can do this. But you could always say like, yeah, but you're not set up.
Yeah.
Like there's
you're not set up to easily do it. I can't pull down Ember Map front end and end up with run a command that gives me a bunch of index.html files. Like I can't.
Also too, with Ember Map front end, you can't tease the dynamic parts from the static parts. So like you said it contaminates your invalidation strategy. We have a whole bunch of static data on. If you think about like the homepage, we have a whole bunch of static data on it, but just one little change to any video on that page is going to invalidate the whole page, regardless of if that change is even displayed on the page. So you could change a video and add, you could change its summary.
Change the length or something. Yes.
Nothing about the homepage changed. And so, in that sense, we're not really set up. And to get there, we would have to put our heads together and say like, okay, what does it actually mean for the homepage to be invalid? Where maybe there's an easier way.
Yeah, or we could just not render on this. Yeah, exactly. Separate it and not and just do the data fetching on the client. That would be one way to do it. And then be like, all right, you're good to cache this HTML until our next deploy, just like all the other assets. And then like now you are actually kind of set up to do it easily, right?
Yep.
So that's pretty interesting actually.
Yeah. And the interesting, and it our main use case for server-side rendering is bots. And I don't see anything that we're talking about here that's incompatible with bots. We would still have like runtime concerns because I wouldn't want to regenerate the whole website every time you change the title because that would affect like the meta tags. But I think it's okay to have, see, this is where it gets muddy because if we have a runtime app, we don't have static assets that are now deployable to the edge.
Yeah, like title, you're saying.
Yeah, like a meta tag with like title that bots
By the way,
use.
have you watched the remix demo yet? They sent their email out.
Oh no, I didn't.
They talk about this. That's like one of the things in the video. It's like
awesome.
You need a title generated from database data, right? Like from a request. And so we have that built in, and you're kind of like, yeah, actually I do, and that's actually usually pretty hard. So it's pretty cool that they're thinking about that. So maybe we'll have more to say on this next time. But
awesome.
I know we've been going long now because this plus yesterday is going to be an epic conversation, but I think it was a good one. Hopefully things are a little more clear now. I'm not sure, but I definitely think JAMstack has some work to do regarding the clarity of what it is, and just. If you're seeing Guillermo and Michael talk and like we're not even agreeing about what cache means or like that I can't take advantage of a CDN if I'm not on JAMstack or something like that. I'm not saying either of these people are like misled. I'm just saying if you're observing the conversation from the outside, it might feel like that. Oh, if I want to do edge deploys, I need to be on the JAMstack. It's not true. But it's also not true that it's easy to do that if you're on your own solution. So just all things I think are worth learning about since we're in like the early stages of this paradigm and it's still pretty confusing, I would say.
Yeah. It's funny. We'll look back on this conversation in 10 years and be like, oh, wow.
True. All right, everyone. Thanks for sticking along with us. Hope you all have a great week and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.